Delete that picture right now.
I wasn't taking a picture of you.
I said turn it off and delete it.
The neon sign outside standard mechanic shops usually hums with a steady, comforting rhythm, but the flickering blue letters above Miller's Auto Repair seemed to buzz with a nervous energy that afternoon. Arthur sat behind the grease-stained counter, his worn leather ledger open, counting the receipts for the third time. The numbers never changed, no matter how many times his calloused fingers ran down the column. Rent was due in 4 days, the supplier for genuine copper gaskets was threatening to cut off credit, and his knees burned with every slight movement. At 62, Arthur looked like a man who had spent 40 years carrying the weight of heavy engines, but the heaviest thing he carried was the silence in his workshop. He was wiping down a chrome wrench when the door slammed open, rattling the glass frame that held his old mechanical certification. 3 men walked in, bringing with them the smell of expensive cologne, cheap whiskey, and an unmistakable air of unearned authority. The man leading the group wore a fitted designer leather jacket, his dark hair slicked back with precise, clinical accuracy. He didn't look at the cars on the lifts, he looked at the place like a landlord preparing to demolish a condemned building. Marcus stopped right in front of the counter, leaning over the wooden barrier until his shadow covered Arthur's ledger. He didn't offer a handshake or a greeting. Instead, he pulled out a gold cigarette case, tapped one against the polished metal, and lit it, completely ignoring the prominent red sign overhead that read "No smoking, flammable fluids." Arthur looked at the cigarette, then looked up into Marcus's sharp, condescending eyes. He kept his hands still, resting them flat against the cold wood of the desk, keeping his breath steady despite the sudden spike in his heart rate. Marcus took a long drag, letting the smoke curl toward the water-damaged ceiling tiles. He smiled, a thin, mechanical gesture that reached nowhere near his eyes, and tossed a heavy manila folder onto the counter, right over Arthur's calculations. "This is your final notice, old man," Marcus said, his voice smooth and dripping with artificial regret. "The city approved the zoning change this morning." Arthur looked at the folder, but he didn't open it. He had read the previous 5 notices, each one more aggressive than the last, filled with legal jargon designed to intimidate small business owners who couldn't afford $500 an hour attorneys. "This land was deeded to my family in 1978, Arthur said quietly, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the steady calm of a man who had faced worse things than arrogant men in expensive suits. "The lease agreement you bought from the bank has a 12-month protection clause. You can't force me out until the end of the year." Marcus laughed, a short, sharp bark that made his 2 stooges behind him chuckle on cue. He leaned in closer, placing both palms flat on the desk, staring directly into Arthur's tired eyes. "Protection clauses are for people who can afford to enforce them in court," Marcus sneered, tapping the ash from his cigarette onto Arthur's clean receipt paper. "Who's going to fight this for you? Your bank account is empty, your equipment is obsolete, and you're running this place all by yourself like a ghost waiting for someone to blow out the candle." The garage was silent except for the rhythmic drip of oil from a suspended engine block near the back wall. Arthur didn't flinch, nor did he raise his voice. He reached out, picked up a small brass paperweight shaped like an engine piston, and placed it deliberately over the papers to keep them from blowing away in the draft. "My family built this place," Arthur said simply. "And my son took over the legal ownership of the business deed 3 years ago. You're talking to the manager, but you're dealing with him. And he doesn't sign away property under threat." Marcus threw his head back and let out a full, mocking laugh that echoed off the high metal beams of the garage ceiling. He looked at his 2 muscle men, then turned back to Arthur with an expression of absolute contempt. He rested his elbows on the counter, shaking his head as if listening to a child explain a fairy tale. "Oh, your son?" Marcus mocked, his tone dripping with cruel amusement. "That's rich. Listen to me, you old fool. I know every property owner, every lawyer, and every city commissioner in this district. If your son owns this shop, then I must be the Hells Angels' boss." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, as Marcus's 2 associates chuckled behind him, feeling completely in control of the room. Marcus picked up his cigarette again, taking another slow drag, waiting for Arthur to break, to show fear, or to surrender the keys. But Arthur just stood there, looking past Marcus, his eyes fixed on the street outside the shop's large, dirt-streaked front windows. The distant rumble of heavy, low-frequency engines had begun to echo down the alleyway, a sound so deep it didn't just carry through the air, it vibrated directly through the concrete floorboards under their feet. The low rumble quickly transformed into a deafening roar as a procession of heavy motorcycles turned into the narrow driveway of Miller's Auto Repair. The ground trembled beneath the workbench, causing small tools to rattle against the pegboard walls. Marcus paused mid-laugh, his brow furrowing as he turned toward the entrance. Through the dirty glass, a line of custom Harley-Davidsons pulled up, blocking the front parking lot completely. The riders wore black leather vests bearing distinct, embroidered patches, a winged skull emblem flanked by the letters that made Marcus's smirk instantly freeze on his face. The lead motorcycle cut its engine, and the thunderous noise died down to a sharp, metallic silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling exhaust pipes. A massive man dismounted, his tall frame dwarfing the doorway as he stepped into the shop. He wore a heavy leather cut with the full colors of the local chapter, his face weathered, lined with scars, and framed by a graying beard. Behind him, 4 other imposing riders stepped into the garage, their presence filling the space and shifting the oxygen in the room within seconds. Marcus took an instinctive step back, his arrogant composure instantly cracking as he bumped into his own security guard. The main rider didn't look at Marcus or his men at first, his eyes scanned the workshop, taking in the familiar smell of motor oil and iron, before settling on the old man standing calm behind the wooden counter. The large man walked forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, until he reached the desk. He reached out a massive, tattooed hand and placed a thick leather envelope directly on top of Marcus's legal folder. "We got the title deed transferred this morning, Dad," the man said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute respect as he looked at Arthur. He then slowly turned his head to look directly at Marcus, his dark eyes narrowing into slits as he took in the developer's expensive suit, the burning cigarette, and the legal. Marcus swallowed hard, his skin turning a pale, ghostly white as the reality of the situation crashed over him. The 2 men behind him looked at each other nervously, shifting their weight, suddenly realizing that their numerical advantage and financial threats meant nothing inside these 4 walls. Marcus tried to open his mouth to speak, to smooth things over with his usual corporate charm, but his voice failed him, producing only a dry raspy sound. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely, heavy with an underlying tension that threatened to snap at any second. The large man stepped closer to Marcus, closing the distance until he was towering over the developer. He reached out with 2 fingers and calmly snatched the burning cigarette from Marcus's hand, dropping it onto the concrete floor and crushing it slowly beneath the heel of his heavy boot. "There's no smoking in my father's shop," he said softly, every word delivered with a dangerous, quiet weight. "And there's no disrespect allowed under this roof. Now, I suggest you take your paper, take your friends, and explain to me why you're harassing the man who built this entire neighborhood." Marcus opened his briefcase with trembling hands, trying desperately to gather the scattered documents without making sudden movements. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by a desperate, instinctual urge to escape the room. We were just discussing a standard property acquisition," Marcus stammered, refusing to make eye contact with the men standing around him. "There was a misunderstanding about the ownership structure. We'll re-evaluate our approach through proper legal channels." "You do that," Arthur's son replied, leaning down so his face was inches from Marcus's. "And while you're re-evaluating, remember one thing. This shop isn't just a business. It's the only thing keeping this family together. If you come back here without an invitation, we won't be talking about zoning laws." Without another word, Marcus and his associates scrambled out of the workshop, nearly tripping over each other as they rushed to their luxury sedan parked near the street. The car sped away, kicking up gravel and dust, leaving the garage in silence once again. Arthur watched them go through the window, then turned his gaze back to his son. The initial shock of the intervention slowly faded, leaving behind a complex, heavy emotion that had been brewing between them for over a decade. You didn't have to come with the whole chapter, Samuel, Arthur said, his voice softer now, stripped of the stern armor he had worn against the developer. He looked at the heavy leather vest his son wore, a symbol of a life Arthur had fought for years to understand. You could have just called. Samuel looked at his father, his expression softening, revealing the tired, haunted eyes of a man who had fought his own long battles. Calls don't stop men like him, Dad, Samuel said, resting his large hands on the wooden counter. Besides, I promised Mom before she passed that I'd make sure this place stayed standing, no matter what path I took to get here. Arthur turned away slightly, clearing his throat as he picked up his rag to wipe down an already clean section of the desk. The mention of his late wife brought back a flood of memories, the long nights she had spent worrying about Samuel, the arguments that had echoed through their small home when Samuel first joined the club, and the years of silence that had followed. Arthur had spent his life building a predictable, honest world out of steel and grease, while Samuel had sought protection and brotherhood in a world that operated on its own ruthless rules. The four riders who had accompanied Samuel quietly stepped back toward the entrance, giving the father and son space, though their presence remained a formidable shield against the outside world. Samuel pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and placed it on the ledger. It was a receipt showing that the outstanding property taxes and supplier debts had been paid in full earlier that morning. Arthur looked at the receipt, then up at his son, confusion and pride warring within his weathered face. Where did you get this kind of money, Sam? Arthur asked, a subtle edge of concern returning to his voice. I know how your organization operates. I don't want this shop funded by anything that would have broken your mother's heart. Samuel smiled faintly, a sad, honest expression that erased the hardened outlaw persona he wore on the street. It's clean, Dad. I sold my share in the custom fabrication shop up north. The one I started after I left the main circuit. I used the money to buy out the bank's note on your mortgage. You don't owe the bank, you don't owe the city, and you certainly don't owe Marcus Vance. Arthur sat down slowly on his wooden stool, his knees giving way under the sudden release of months of constant pressure. He looked around the workshop, the old tools his father had given him, the lifts that had held thousands of cars, the walls that had absorbed 50 years of his life's work. It was all safe, preserved not by a legal firm or a court order, but by the stubborn loyalty of a son he thought he had lost years ago. I thought you hated this place, Arthur whispered, looking at the concrete floor where the oil stain from his first restoration project still remained visible. When you left 10 years ago, you said you never wanted to smell motor oil again. I hated seeing you work yourself to death for a place that never gave anything back, Samuel answered quietly, stepping around the counter to stand next to his father. I was young and angry, and I didn't understand that you weren't working for the shop. You were working for us. It took me 10 years and a lot of wrong turns to realize that the only thing worth fighting for is the foundation built by the people who loved you. The garage was filled with a quiet understanding, the years of resentment dissolving in the still air of the workshop. Outside, the sun began to dip below the skyline, casting long, warm shadows across the bay doors. Samuel reached out and placed a hand on his father's shoulder, a gesture simple and firm, bridging the long silence that had existed between them for so long. We have a lot of work to do, old man, Samuel said, gesturing toward a classic 1969 Mustang sitting in the corner, covered in dust and waiting for a complete engine rebuild. That engine isn't going to pull itself out. Arthur looked at the car, then up at his son, a faint, genuine smile finally appearing on his face for the first time in years. You still remember how to hold a torque wrench, or do I have to teach you all over again? You can try, Samuel laughed, pulling off his heavy leather cut and tossing it onto the chair, revealing the grease-stained work shirt he wore underneath, a shirt bearing the embroidered name Miller and Son. As the twilight settled over the city, the lights inside Miller's auto repair burned bright and steady. The hum of the air compressor filled the room, accompanied by the familiar, rhythmic sound of metal tools clinking against steel. The threats from the outside world were gone, replaced by the enduring strength of a legacy protected, a bond restored, and a family home that would remain standing for generations to come.